Did you ever brief the CIA on what the NSA had on these terrorists prior to 9/11? So you would have briefed them after 9/11 and said, hey, here's what we had and here's what could have been known. Did that ever go on?
You see, I left NSA in October of 2001, so any of the data that was run and pulled out by Tom Drake, he did after I left. So I couldn't brief CIA on that. But what I did do with Ed Loomis and Kirk Wiebe, we went through open source data in 2002 and pulled together all the material that was there, including the names of the targets of the terrorists. They had names for the targets, like the towers, the Twin Towers were called Town Center. The Capitol building was called Law, and the White House was called Fine Arts. And so they talked about these. These were the codes they used for the targets in emails and things that they had said. And we got this out of open source off the web using Google. So we did brief them on what we were able to pull out of open source. And that was as contractors, we were going in saying, this is what you can do with open source. And we went through that, and I say, how did you ever know all that? And I said, it's right there in open source, you can get it too, So, yes, we did brief them on that, but it was from open source material, not from anything that NSA had.
That's good to clarify. That's just good to clarify that it was from open source material. It was widely available. Right. Let me ask this specific question. Within that data set that was widely, openly available, was the attack date of September 11th, 2001 in that correspondence to be found?
Yes, it was, yeah. In fact, the way they depicted it as we say 9/11, 9th month, 11th day, but they'll say day month. So they would put a line, and then a pi, a circle, and a line. That would be 11/9. So the 11th day of September. That was mentioned as one of the date for the event.
What was the response of the CIA when you demonstrated this ability from open source data?
They just couldn't believe that we got that information out of open source. They couldn't believe that it was there. That's all.
Did the FBI have access to that data as well?
At the time, I don't think at the time they did. I mean, NSA had that kind of information, so they didn't share that kind of data, which they, of course, should. I mean, if that kind of information came to me when I was in the SIGINT Automation Research Center, if they didn't want to report it, I would pick up the gray phone, which is the encrypted phone for the U.S. government, and call somebody at CIA or FBI and say, here's what I have, take action on it, will you? I can't seem to get it out of my place. They don't want to report this, but here's what it is. I mean, you do those kinds of things when those kinds of important things. You don't care what your management says because this is just too important. You do those kinds of things. But there's very few people there. Most NSA employees would say, okay, we won't do that. For example, the 9/11 crowd did a typical military attack profile. They showed that the military profiles will simply be the military moves to positions to prepare for the attack. In other words, there's takeoff positions for the attack. They prepare for the attack by setting up their command and control system, and then they execute the attack from there. But you can see that movement and shuffling to get in position to do that, and that's a pretty typical military action. Well, the terrorists did exactly the same thing. They moved to hotels next to airports and then bought the tickets for the airplanes and then got on the airplanes simultaneously. So you could see that buildup. That was an obvious attack coming.
What are some of the things about 9/11, 13 years later, that disturb you that might not have been investigated properly? Or what are some of the anomalies or things that, are like a splinter in your mind about 9/11?
Well, in the intelligence arena, there's, of course, the inadequate search of the database that NSA did. And after the fact, they found the data and then covering it up. And not letting it be exposed to the congressional investigations or the 9/11 Commission, to my knowledge, anyway. So that meant that they didn't have those aspects to deal with and couldn't deal with it in terms of their reports or in their studies. And so, and then there's the physical issues. I've been talking to some physicists recently and engineers and so on, and they have a coalition of people, the 9/11 Truth Group, which is saying there are certain aspects of 9/11, the physical nature of how the things occurred, that should have been addressed by these different studies and have not been. Physical things, observable acts like the like molten metal in the buildings, coming out of the buildings, and like that certain temperatures physics requires certain temperatures for that to occur, and how you can't get that kind of temperature in a fire in a building like that.
So you can't identify the source of what's causing that.
Right, but that's a physical fact that should have been addressed and dealt with. And also Building 7 falling straight on its footprint, that kind of thing is suspicious. How could a building like that fall that way? And that was not even addressed. So none of those things, or some of the other things they were showing me, were also suspicious that they should have addressed, and they didn't. And so none of the studies came out with those. So that's basically a very bad, even NIST didn't do that. I mean, that's not good science at all. I mean, you don't ignore facts that don't fit your preconceived outcome. In other words, if I wanted to solve a crypt problem and I had a preconceived idea of how it went there, and any fact that came along about that system that didn't fit my preconceived idea, I threw them away, I would always fail. Never solve any of them.
Was there anything else with 9/11 that got your attention that you thought this is really strange? And with all the budget power that we have focused on defense in this country, that there were multiple layers of failure that kind of coalesced to bring that event about?
Well, I mean, it was on virtually every level. They were all pretty much out to lunch for that attack, and they ignored the basic things that they should never have ignored. Certainly, if I was aware of them, I wouldn't have hesitated in notifying people. But I would do it on the gray phone.
So we had multiple levels of security failures from our intelligence community on 9/11. And where's the list I can find of people who got fired because they didn't do their job?
It will be on a blank sheet of paper. Okay?
It'd be
There's
redacted.
your list. Right. I mean, they all got promoted, I think. They all got elevated to higher positions, and they got more money, and the budgets were increased, tripled, basically. So, I mean, now, if you looked at it from 9/11 on up till now, I mean, we've spent almost $1 trillion in the intelligence community since that time.
Around November 2001, Thin Thread received a new input. Instead of being focused on surveillance of an international variety and not focused on Americans, it was turned on us. Can you describe that process? And as its creator, is that something you ever dreamed of when you were making it?
First of all, it wasn't called Thin Thread. That was a replicate. They replicated the code and called it Stellar Wind. Okay, that was the Stellar Wind program. Then they started inputting that data into that domestic data into that program. And the program simply looked at data and did what it was supposed to do with data, which is index and graph and pull things together and correlate them and manage them. That was what they. I mean, and all the things we had in Thin Thread that were to protect people and also monitor what people were doing with the data, they eliminated. They removed that from the software. So those restrictions were no longer involved in any of the processing. So that meant they took away any protections that anybody had, U.S. citizen or otherwise. So there were no protections at all then for anybody.
But isn't it okay to take away our protection to give us security?
No, because that's a violation of the constitutional rights of everybody, starting with the First Amendment, where you have the right to free association. By putting together the social network that you have in the phone network or the email network, that lays out everybody you're associated with. So the First Amendment doesn't say you have the right to association with anybody as long as NSA knows about it, or as long as the government knows about it. That's not the point. The point is the government was supposed to stay out of your affairs. These are your affairs. That's what the First Amendment was all about. That's what the Fourth Amendment primarily was about, and that's what the Constitution's about.